I suggest that this collection of essays of life in medieval Ireland offers some new and intellectually stimulating explorations into a pivotal period of Irish history, a period during which Ireland was transformed from being an island at the edge of what was then considered to be the known world to becoming the island of saints and scholars. It is this medieval period that has interested our SAS, and it is no surprise that it is also this medieval period that captivates most of us, the members of Clans of Ireland and the members of the Standing Council of Irish Chiefs and Chieftains. Most of us have a particular thirst for knowledge of Gaelic Ireland, particularly the unexplored recesses of our history, just as the ancient mariner, St. Brendan, wished to explore a world that he felt existed, but that had not been previously explored or charted. Many of you will know that Clans of Ireland Cathaoirleach is an independent, permanent authority established to register Irish clans and historical families. Our establishment occurred as a result of the resurgence of interest in Irish heritage following the development of a more mature attitude to our history. The development of Cathaoirleach has led to the revival of many Irish clans and the recognition of the cultural value of many Irish historical families. Indeed, there is a continuing open invitation policy to those interested in Irish clans to contact us with a view to reviving their Irish clan. Recognition will depend on the ability of applicants to provide evidence of the existence of a distinct historical clan or family identity within a geographic area. The Register of Clans of Ireland includes families of Gaelic Irish, Norse, Anglo-Norman, Scots, Gallo-Glass, Huguenot, and other Quaker origins. Clans of Ireland maintains a strong and positive relationship through our joint sponsorship of the compilation of essays such as this one, Gaelic Ireland, Lordship, Saints and Learning, in addition to the annual essay competition, which we sponsor jointly with the Standing Council of Irish Chiefs and Chieftains. I look at you, our members, and see culturally intelligent, eager, and contemporary tribal people. Many of you who live across the globe wish to explore your family or tribal history so that you can establish a greater understanding of identity, which has now become so rare in this multicultural global society in which we live. Clans of Ireland is ideologically committed to the development of an objective understanding of Ireland's heritage and culture, using modern academic tools and varying philosophical approaches to historical concepts, so that people who are interested in discovering where they have come from might take inspiration from their ancestors as they travel into the future with a greater sense of common purpose. Thus, it is no coincidence that the subject matter of these essays has been based on the politics, culture, scholarship, and social life of Gaelic Ireland. In essence, Gaelic Ireland, Lordship, Saints and Learning is an overview of life during a period of over 1,000 years, during which Ireland was renowned as a major centre of learning, during which our legal system became imprinted on us as a people. This culture and education continues to be commemorated today by the Irish throughout the world. Therefore, may I strongly suggest to you that this anthology, with its refined scholarly integrity, speaks to anyone who is interested in the study of our early Irish history, as each of these scholars, a specialist in his or her field, has explored a minute aspect of their interest so that your knowledge can be expanded. I recommend Gaelic Ireland, Lordship, Saints and Learning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Now, we'll call upon Luke to give us the background to this compilation. These things don't simply happen. Although hopefully they look like they just happened, they are a very, very uniquely engineered feat to appear on the shelf. Luke.
Ihua, agus Fulcherov Galir, Huig, Ansholu, Lara. I wish to welcome everyone this evening to the launch of the third anthology of the Clans of Ireland, Finchina Heron, and the Standing Council of Irish Chiefs and Chieftains. We are delighted to have both a physical audience here in attendance and also an online audience courtesy of Zoom. The large turnout is indicative of the wide appeal of Irish history, as well as abiding worldwide interest in Irish culture, heritage, and genealogy. So I'm especially pleased that we are joined by people in various time zones and countries, places far removed from us here tonight at St. Stephen's Green Club in Dublin, but of course well known to us as places where the great Irish diaspora settled. I wish to list some of those places because it's imperative to recognize that what we do in the Clans of Ireland is very much about the historical links that bind us together from many places and contexts and orientates us towards an appreciation of Ireland's historic families and clans. Whether it's New York, Hartford or Chicago, LA, Wellington or Sydney, Cape Town, Paris or London, or close to home such as Gweedore, Spiddal or Cork, you're all most very welcome. And it is wonderful you can participate in this event virtually. We at the Clans of Ireland send you our salutations no matter where in the world you may reside. Rarely is a scholarly work a singular undertaking, and indeed even more so for an anthology which comprises of some 17 essays. I wish to first and foremost to acknowledge the assistance of the Standing Council of Irish Chiefs and Chieftains, in particular Conor O'Brien, an Breanach. It is no exaggeration to say that without the Council's generous assistance, this anthology would not have been possible. I also extend thanks to the other editor of the anthology, Dr. Katharine Sims, whose adjudication of the essay competition and subsequent assistance was given both graciously and kindly. The Clans of Ireland is indeed indebted to Dr. Sims for her continued participation in this event, and for which we and all the contributors are most very grateful. On the theme of thank yous, I would like to thank Nick Maxwell of Wordwell Books for his professionalism and commitment to see the project through. And I think I speak for everyone here tonight to say that the finished product is certainly worthy of any bookshelf. I also thank those Clans of Ireland board members who reviewed various articles and provided both advice and assistance. Last, but certainly not least, I wish to acknowledge the large debt that we owe each of the contributors to the anthology. Thank you for taking the time to produce the fruits of the work which we are gathered here tonight to celebrate. I would like to say a few words about the anthology and its constituent parts, followed by some musings on the study of medieval Gaelic Ireland. For those of you who already have a copy of the anthology, you'll notice that it's divided into 3 parts. The first part takes as its focus politics, culture, and lordship. The second as saints, texts, and contexts. And the third part as scholarship, scholars, and places. This tripartite division was done so as to reflect the wide-ranging and diverse contributions and to integrate them under the broader theme of Gaelic Ireland, Lordship, Saints, and Learning. The range of essay contributions is indeed diverse. In the first part of the anthology, we have contributions focusing on Norse sea power in the Hebrides and the political theory of Gaelic lordships and its succession disputes. Other essays take as their key focus ecclesiastical politics, literary and cultural elements of native Gaelic lordship, and the architectural and typological history of that ubiquitous feature of the Irish countryside, the medieval tower house. The second section of our tripartite division takes as its focus hagiography and medieval texts. Contributors here examine saints' lives to better comprehend a particular historical or textual milieu. Early Christian settlement in the west of Ireland is also discussed in one essay, as is the interpretation of a manuscript text compiled in Sean Gwelga in Old Irish. And finally, this second section of the anthology includes a contribution that attempts to address a significant lacuna in scholarship, that is, using primary sources to identify medieval communication routes, which are recorded in the 14th century saga text, the Catharine Herlig, from the Gaelic Lordship of North Munster, or Thomond. The third and final section of our anthology concerns scholarship, scholars, and places. In this part of the anthology are a number of contributions which reflect the theme of learning and scholarship in medieval and early modern Ireland. Here we have a contribution that draws from archaeology, history, and folklore, and which identifies the great 17th century historian Rory O'Flaherty's own schoolhouse and residence at Park near Spiddal in County Galway. It is to the memory of this stalwart of Gaelic lordship that the anthology is dedicated. O'Flaherty was an important tradition bearer of the classical Gaelic learned tradition, whose works made a significant contribution to the study of the antiquarian past. Whilst his writings were composed under personal hardship at a peripheral westerly location, nevertheless, they drew upon the deep reserve of Irish scholarship that stretched back to the pre-12th century monastic scriptoria. On the theme of continuity of scholarship, the next contribution focuses on one of the great bardic families of medieval Ireland, the Clan Cra, or the McGrath family, whose literary output stretched from the 11th to the 17th century. The final paper in this section of the anthology is an investigation of the knowledge of Greek in early medieval Ireland, a question that has long exercised the minds of modern scholars. These 17 contributions make up the third anthology by the Clans of Ireland. I commend them to you all. I wish to now say a few words as to why one should study medieval Gaelic Ireland, something that many people would regard as rather esoteric. With its complexity of politics, culture, and linguistic groups, and not least its location on the westerly fringe of Europe, Gaelic Ireland could be seen as rather obscure, even parochial, and somewhat removed from broader developments underway in contemporary societies in Europe. But the truth is, now is an exciting time to study medieval Gaelic Ireland. The Irish tradition flourishing at the edge of Europe and stretching back to late antiquity in no small way contributed to the cultural, religious, and scholarly life in what we now call the early medieval period. We needn't cite the long list of monastic centres of learning established by the Irish in Europe, nor the impressive number of Irish scholars whose works have been preserved in various medieval manuscripts. It suffices to say that the scholarly tradition of the Irish, both in the vernacular and in Latin, stands as a testament to the vigour and creativity of the Irish during this formative period. This body of tradition is becoming more accessible to scholars than ever before, thanks to technology and the proliferation of new journals, books, and online resources. As more texts are digitised and available online, and with the application of new technology, we can efficiently access texts and data, as well as collaborate with scholars from across the globe. We can disseminate ideas quicker, and we can also delve into issues at a much deeper level, albeit from afar. The advent of new archaeological methods and the explosion of interest around DNA studies means that new light is being thrown on not just the physical heritage of Gaelic Ireland, but upon its very people. As is well known, the nature of Gaelic and Irish landscapes means that physical sites associated with Gaelic Ireland are relatively accessible. But the advent of digital humanities, that is, online texts and so forth, and other technologies has rendered a visit to an archive a wholly new experience, and, if encountered online, a rich information highway of data in the form of texts, images, maps, surveys, commentaries, and much else besides. What opens up to us is a new digital world and a nexus of new information which is available at our very fingertips, from which new pathways of understanding are made possible. This new data ecosystem, if I may call it as such, has been made possible by the application of technology and is promising to transform the way we interpret and study the past. It is no less felt than the study of medieval Gaelic Ireland, and we see through such initiatives like the Irish Script on Screen project or the Bardic Poetry database, new innovative ways to preserve our primary texts and to study them no matter where in the world we may live. All of this is to be applauded, and it renders the study of Gaelic Ireland open to people outside of Ireland in which to undertake research without the need to physically consult the texts in question. We're beginning to see the success of this new data ecosystem in modern scholarship. And indeed, the fruits are reflected by the range of contributors in the anthology that we are launching here today. The study of medieval Ireland, then, is undergoing a quiet renaissance. In both an actual and figurative sense, late medieval Ireland is wedged between two periods that have captured the attention of scholars and the public alike. First, the early medieval period, stretching from the era of Christian conversion of the 5th and 6th century to the proverbial golden age of saints and scholars, insula sanctorum et doctorum, if we are to use the phrase attributed to Marianus Scotus, an 11th century Irish monk, and to the second period, that is the Reformation period of the 16th century, which has received much scholarly attention. In between these two periods lie the High Middle Ages. Modern scholarship has tended to pick up on the thread from the Reformation onwards, and as a consequence, we have more scholarship about the 16th and 17th century Ireland than indeed we do about the 14th and 15th century Ireland. As a result, less has been said about that in-between period of the High Middle Ages, and so less is known about the culture and politics of the Gaelic and Gaelicized Irish during this period, and indeed less known than that of the earlier period or the later period. Thankfully, this situation is beginning to be reversed. The focus on political, cultural, and literary achievements of Gaelic Ireland has especially come to the fore in recent decades. Early generations of scholars have focused on quaint ideas such as aristocratic home rule or the biographies of leading dynasts and dynasties. But in recent decades, scholarship has emphasized the role of Gaelic institutions, both political and cultural. Scholars have written on the importance of acculturation, kinship and heredity in society, and the literary achievements of medieval Gaelic Ireland expressed in the narratives, tales, poems, law codes, and other such writings. Much work remains, however, to fully illuminate the history of the Gaelic Irish, who form the majority of the people and language group of the island of Ireland during this most formative period. For example, our knowledge of the material living conditions of the late medieval Gaelic Irish, as well as a function of kinship and other social institutions, is imperfect and often less than that which we know for the preceding early Christian period. Notwithstanding this, the burgeoning scholarship of medieval Gaelic Ireland in recent decades has introduced a new cohort of scholars who have questioned some of the old certainties, while the publication of new texts and sources, along with the application of new technology, has enabled scholars to better date and provide solutions to problems of chronology and provenance. All of this has meant that the field of study has been widened and much profit reaped from re-examining familiar sources. Sources long neglected, such as genealogies, the extensive corpus of bardic poems, as well as ecclesiastical sources held in foreign repositories, are now more accessible and throw new light on society and culture in the high medieval period. This, coupled with archaeological excavation of the places of scholarship of the learned class and other privileged aspects of Gaelic society, are revealing new details about the life in medieval Gaelic Ireland. What is significant, especially for the Clans of Ireland, is that a substantial amount of this work is being conducted outside of the walls of academia. Independent scholars continue to publish books and expand the annals of local history organizations. Ireland is unique in that its network of local history societies, parish magazines, provincial journals up and down the country have helped record history and folklore, ensuring that the locale is not forgotten in the writing of history. This rich harvest of local history is attested in diverse fields, from scholarly research in onomastics, folklore, local history, to Irish language studies and archaeology, all of which make for a vigorous and varied pursuit of scholarship. This can feed into the academic study of history, assisting professional scholars who are not intimate with localities or local traditions. It also helps us move away from grand narratives about the past towards a more granular, idiosyncratic understanding of events and the people who shaped them. The work of the Clans of Ireland through our anthology projects is not only to encourage independent scholars to publish their work, but also to provide a platform from which they can engage with the academy and the broader academic debates. Academia functions best when there's a competition of ideas, and to this end, the interest shown in Irish history by independent scholars can be harnessed in order to progress our understanding of medieval Gaelic Ireland. When we arrive at a fuller assessment of medieval Gaelic Ireland, only then can we properly begin to understand some of the vexing issues of scholarship that has exercised the minds of past generations of historians. For instance, the failure of the Reformation in Ireland, or the extent of Gaelicization in territories controlled by Anglo-Norman lords, just to name two such examples. A fuller understanding of medieval Ireland will also lay solid foundations for the studies in genealogy and family history research, two subjects that the Clans of Ireland are at the forefront of promoting. Before I close, it would be remiss of me not to mention the very significant progress in Irish surname and genealogy studies. Much of this is being carried forth in informal settings by dedicated family historians, often by members of the diaspora. In fact, many such people are listening in today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say that I commend your work. I'd like to go even further and encourage all of you to engage with the primary sources in your research, the Irish Annals, genealogical tracts, literary sources, and records of administration, many of which, as I noted at the outset of my talk, can now be accessed online. In doing so, I'd encourage you to relate your findings back to the historical, cultural context, which will invariably enrich your individual family histories. Linking family history scholarship back to academia is an important way to improve accessibility of scholarship for non-specialists, and a sure way to encourage the kind of engagement with academic circles which I alluded to earlier. It is the Clans of Ireland's contribution to this expanding body of scholarship that we offer up this anthology, and hope that it serves to help forward your own research on this fascinating period of Gaelic Ireland. Darav Margav. For the second part of our launch tonight, I'm talking to 4 of the anthology's contributors about their essays in order to gain a better insight into the topics which they have chosen to write about. So, to begin this segment of our launch, I invite Daniel Curley up here to join me. Thanks, Daniel. Please take a seat. We might start just with some background of biographical information. Daniel completed his MA in medieval studies in NUI Galway, and in October was awarded his PhD on the elite archaeologies of the medieval Ó Ceallaigh lords of the Lordship of Eval. Daniel is also the current manager of the Rathcrohan Visitor Centre in Roscommon. Daniel has published a number of books and articles, and he was a winner of the 2019 Chiefs and Clans Essay Competition Prize for his essay on the medieval Ewana Lordship, which is printed in the anthology. Congratulations. Thank you. So this takes me on to your essay, Daniel. It's an interesting piece which takes as a core focus, obviously a very important figure of the Gaelic revival of the 14th century. The 14th century was a pivotal period of Gaelic Irish history, and we see a number of Gaelic lordships expand during this period and a renewed cultural life take hold. Part of this seems to be related to the decline of the Anglo-Norman colony and also perhaps to the adoption of new military styles by the Gaelic Irish, such as the importation of Gaelic mercenaries and the erection of stone castles. We also start to see documents in Irish from this period indicating somewhat of a vernacular literary revival, which you touch on in your essay. And of course, one exceptional document is a saga narrative text called the Catharine or the Battle Career of Turlough O'Brien, which focuses on the wars between the O'Briens and the Anglo-Normans in County Clare. It was written in the 1330s or 1340s by a McGrath poet. This document itself is subject to one of the essays in the anthology. But I think what is fascinating in your essay is a cultural dimension which is explored. Surely it's significant that there was a hiatus in Gaelic scholarship between the late 12th and up until the mid 14th century. But of course, when it started again, it was centered around Clonmacnoise and the East Galway area, which is a focus of your paper. And its chief promoter being the learned Shanachie Sean O'Dugan, who was the author of a long historical and topographical poem, which is known in English as Let Us Journey Around Ireland. This poem enumerates the estates of the nobility, both in Ulster and in Leinster, up to the arrival of the Anglo-Norman conquest. Sean O'Dugan was a significant cultural and literary figure of his time. So Daniel, you might say a few words about this Gaelic cultural and literary revival, which you've written about. Indeed, you term it a renaissance. And perhaps maybe you'll say some words about its significance.
Yeah, so I suppose looking at the protagonist in the essay was a William Ó Ceallaigh. So that's the lens that I chose to look through it as part of my wider PhD research as well. And effectively, I suppose what was apparent was that in the late 13th century and early 14th century, I suppose an aspiring Gaelic lord is most likely to take upon either acquiescent to Anglo-Norman wants and needs, or perhaps going in a more warlike direction. And that's what we see in the preoccupations of the predecessors to William Bui on the landscape. And that seems to culminate, for me at least. You mentioned Cara of Turlough, and I know Tygo Kelly is mentioned in it a number of times, and he was a lord of Ivina at that point in time. He meets his end at the Second Battle of Athenry, along with a whole number of O'Kelly eligible princes. But the Battle of Athenry is an interesting, I suppose, turning point or high water mark, because it seems to mark the point in time where the Anglo-Norman colony, where it does exist, and in the East Galway Southwest Common landscape, it only really exists as far as we can see in the towns. In the rural landscape, Gaelic, it is still Gaelic dominated, it is still Gaelic supported. And after the Battle of Athenry, it seems the case that the Anglo-Norman colony in its reality contracts extremely, and into that vacuum comes the William Bui that we encounter, and he comes to the lordship in circa 1349, circa 1350, and with him he's looking to unify Ivina. He's not the sole claimant to the title. He's working very diligently in both militaristic terms. He's going on several cattle raids, but he's also erecting new courts. He's founding Kilconnell Franciscan Friary in its first iteration. He's the one that organises this great Christmas feast that is a very prominent part of Gaelic literary society, and well known possibly amongst a lot of the audience here tonight. And it's a case that what he's trying to do is he's trying to, as far as I could see, resurrect and rejuvenate, create a renaissance in terms of what a Gaelic lord aspires to be. And that comes in many manifestations, from the stone constructions through to the commissioning of monasteries, into the commissioning of manuscripts, and even in the form of residence that they're trying to choose to reside in. And it's funny that the residences that they're choosing to reside in from an archaeological point of view are archaic in form. They're not in keeping what we'd consider as innovations in a forward-thinking sense. They're actually seeming to tie themselves to an older, antique, legitimizing ideology, which is very interesting, that when they're constructing the likes of Kilconnell Friary or commissioning the Lower Ivina, they're also choosing to reside on Cronoaks. They're choosing to reside, despite the resources that they have and the wealth that they have and the shows and displays of wealth that they have, in these more archaic forms of settlement.
Thank you very much, Daniel. In your essay, you essentially use a discussion about the Ó Ceallaigh Lordship to explain the cultural revival that took place, and you provide obviously insights about it, which you just alluded to there. And of course, one such event which you mentioned was a famous Christmas gathering, or crinu, in 1351. This event was immortalized in the poem Fili Erin Go Hinchuk, The Poets of Ireland Go to One House, which was of course written by the master poet Geoffrey Fionn Ó Ceallaigh. So you might talk a little bit more about this Christmas feast of 1351 and why Ó Ceallaigh was so keen to hold it. What does it tell us about the mentality of a Gaelic lord towards the end of the 14th century?
So I suppose picking up on the previous points and building upon that, it's really a case of very early in his career as Lord, he's attempting to place a very strong stamp of importance, of authority, of power. And when you can consider removing the learned professions from their traditional chiefly residences around Christmas from quite far afield, one would suggest, with the poem in mind, and bringing them all to South Roscommon, I'd recommend anyone to do so. It's a very, very good thing to do. But the idea behind that, of stripping the learned professions from their more routine locations at Christmas to this one focal point, is a very strong show of strength, as well as an interest in patronizing the arts and showing the cultural dimensions that are apparent in the mindset of William Bui. And he's shown himself to be a very outward thinking, a very proactive, a very innovative and ambitious Gaelic lord. And he's doing it in one hand in order to show that hospitality and generosity, but on the other hand also as a means of really putting a stamp of authority on his reign. And that comes about in large part. His plans come to fruition in the sense that he has a very long reign, which is not normal for a later medieval Gaelic lord. And then his son directly takes over from, which is again not the most routine right of succession. And between the two of them, they're reigning for over a period of, as far as I can recall, nearly 70 years, and which is not normal. So that level of stability is something that leads to the beginnings of the Ó Ceallaigh Lordship at its most expansive terms, its most wealthy in its patronizing of other religious institutions in the vicinity. And then also, I suppose, it sets them up quite nicely for the late medieval period in those terms.
Great. Thank you for your contribution, Daniel. Thank you. Our second contributor is Rob O'Halloran. Rob is an independent scholar whose scholarly interests focus on the O'Hallorans of County Clare, or more precisely, the Slieve-Ochty region. Rob lives and works in the UK, and in his professional career is based around financial services and regulatory policy, an area of expertise which happens to dovetail with my own, in fact. In his essay, Rob details the history of a medium-sized Gaelic lineage. What is fascinating about this piece of detective work is he manages to cohere a number of disparate sources together in order to trace the O'Hallorans since medieval times, whilst at the same time also throwing light on the social standing and activities of a lesser lineage in a Gaelic lordship. The O'Hallorans were settled in what we call the McNamara Lordship of Clan Cullen, essentially comprising most of the east of County Clare, which was in its day, particularly in the 15th century, a large and successful and vigorous lordship. The McNamaras were virtually independent within their sphere of influence, and they were responsible for erecting dozens of tower houses to control their territory. And indeed, they were subject of a number of Irish language texts and deeds which have come down to us, most notably a late 14th century rental of their estates, as well as being recipients of bardic poetry. One 14th century poem refers to the McNamaras as eminent hunting hounds and compares the McNamaras to guarding the borders of their estates like fearsome warlike hounds. And of course, one family who lived on the northern periphery of that lordship were indeed the O'Hallorans. So we might begin, Rob, with you giving some overview of the O'Hallorans and what your research has distilled about them, please.
Great, thanks, Luke. So the O'Hallorans, as Luke says, were a middle-sized lineage, and putting together their story was quite difficult because they only very infrequently appear in the historical record. So piecing this together was a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. What we do know is that they were a Dalcashian family, and at least according to the genealogies, they were close kinsmen of the McNamaras. So as you referenced there, the McNamaras being a far more powerful, prolific lineage. So it served the O'Halloran's purposes to be linked to that more powerful family. In researching the O'Halloran's, it became clear very early on that they were not a professional lineage, nor were they really a clerical family in the wider sense of the term. But what they were was a landholding lineage, perhaps of some significance within the McNamara Lordship. So as you mentioned, Luke, the eastern part of Thomond. And the evidence we have for this is the 14th century McNamara rental, which is an absolutely essential document which I relied on heavily in my study. This essentially lists out a series of land denominations that were taxed, in some cases quite heavily, by the McNamaras. And one of these denominations was named as Faha I Alwaran, so O'Halloran's Green. And this is the district more commonly known or perhaps latterly known as Fahy. Now, Fahy in the medieval period was a very sizable tract of land, and it was, as Luke mentioned, high up in the Slieve Orty Mountains, right on the northeastern frontier of Thomond. And what we find is that this type of border zone location could be very important in medieval Gaelic lordships. It was typically a place for exchange, it was a place for mediation, it could be a place for defense, and it often had particularly high concentrations of members of the learned lineages and ecclesiastical sites as well. And I think Fahy meets a number of these criteria. So the impression I got in researching this was that the O'Hallorans played some type of marcher or border zone role that was strategically important to the rest of the lordship. And really the conclusion that I try to reach in the paper is that what the family in one sense lacked in terms of formal status on the one hand, they made up for on the other hand in terms of holding this really strategically key parcel of land.
Thank you indeed for that. So I think you've sort of alluded to it, but I'd like to talk a little bit about that possibility which you raise in your paper, that essentially the O'Hallorans were Eircnachs, the administrators or stewards of church land, particularly episcopal land. Maybe you can say a little bit more about that and the evidence behind that in your theory. If I remember correctly, I think you segue in your paper into a discussion around the fact that they turn up in a 17th century rent roll of not of Killaloe, the Diocese of Killaloe, but in fact the Diocese of Kilmacduagh, which is across the border in South Galway, as episcopal tenants, which is a type of thing you would expect Eircnachs in the later medieval period, and certainly by the 17th century, to be tenants on the episcopal mensa or the episcopal estate of the various bishops. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and the possibility of their land as being this idea of a stopover for pilgrimage, yes, perhaps between Inishcaltra and Kilmacduagh, which I think is another point which you mute in your paper.
Indeed. Thank you. Thanks, Luke. Yes, so maybe just starting on the ecclesiastical features within Fahy. So we have there the remains of a 15th century stone-built church. It might in fact be a bit earlier than that. And nearby there is also a Balawn holy well. And these are important features that indicate a number of things. One is it points to, in an otherwise sparsely populated district, it points to an ecclesiastical site potentially of some importance. It may well have been a way station or a stopover point on that pilgrimage route you referred to, Kilmacduagh down to Inishcaltra. It can't be proven, but there is some good circumstantial evidence, at least, that that was the case. I think added to that, the presence of this Balawn holy well is an interesting feature, because that in its own right would have attracted pilgrimage activity. So perhaps we're seeing a combination of things here, a potential stopover site as well as a pilgrimage destination in itself. It's certainly an interesting site. I think just coming onto the theme of the sort of complexities of the episcopal arrangement. So you're absolutely right. For the duration, it seems, of the medieval period, there was this very curious arrangement in place whereby the O'Halloran's held the 2 quarters of land at Farhee, not from, as you say, Killaloe, the diocese in which it's located, but from the neighbouring diocese of Kilmacduagh. And the evidence for this is an early 17th century record of a bishop's visitation or circuit, which records that that is the case. Now, I think this raises a number of very interesting issues and areas. This type of cross-border influence does occur elsewhere, although it is relatively rare. I think looking at those borders in a little bit more detail, we see that the diocese of Kilmacduagh, its borders almost exactly replicate the borders of the kingdom of Fiacrach Eidna, which was the former dominant power in the area in the early Middle Ages. So what we're seeing perhaps is a vestige or a relic of that prior period of dominance in Farhee. For the O'Hallorans, I think this meant that they were certainly tenants of church lands, potentially chief tenants. That opens the possibility that they were an Urna family. I couldn't anywhere prove that, despite best efforts, but I had a good go. The interesting thing, though, if that is the case, they held that office from the neighbouring diocese, not the one in which they are located, as we've been saying. And really, the final thought I had here was this picture seems to be part of a wider theme of marginality that runs through the O'Halloran's position in late medieval Thomond.
Great. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I invite Sally, Finn, Kelsey to the chair.
My notes, in case I forget my words.
Thanks, Sally. So I wish to welcome Sally and, of course, her contribution to the anthology, which was focused on the aspects of Greek learning in early medieval Ireland. Sally is currently undertaking a PhD at Trinity College on the production and export of Ireland's wool and woolen cloth, and she has an interest in medieval connections between Ireland, Britain, and Europe. So in your essay, you point to small fragments of Greek, which are found in the manuscript of Adovnan's Life of Columcille, or Columba, and also in the Book of Armagh. Among the various bits of evidence for Greek learning in Ireland, you point to it potentially coming to Ireland via Britain. And in particular, you note the establishment of a school in Canterbury by Theodore of Tarsus, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 7th century, and of course himself a Greek speaker and hailing from Anatolia. So what might this tell us about the study of Greek in early medieval Ireland? And as we know, the Irish monastic schools during that period were well known for producing high quality Latin from the 6th century. But what do we know about Greek?
Well, as you said, like the Irish monastic schools were really well known for their learning. In fact, it's quite well known that Bede talks about Anglo-Saxon scholars coming over in quite large numbers to study over here. And he talks about how well they were looked after. They were given free food and free books and free teaching. But he never mentions anything about them learning Greek. And he tends to focus on things like that. He seems to focus quite a bit on, he mentions quite often when people have learnt Greek. So we presume that they weren't learning Greek here. As you say, in my essay, I look at the Greek, the small bits of Greek that are in particularly in the earliest manuscript of the Life of Columba, and also in the Book of Armagh. they really are quite fragmentary. They're not a great, there's not loads of them. In the life of Columba, Doben, the scribe, wrote out the Lord's Prayer in Greek, using Greek letters and in the Greek language. And in the book of Amar, Ferdomnach, the scribe, wrote the Latin Lord's Prayer using Greek letters, and they used other little tiny bits of Greek, but there's not a great deal in there. But it was I got quite excited when I first saw it, because it just seemed so unexpected, I suppose. These little bits of Greek letters in the middle of early medieval Irish Latin was totally unexpected. And at the end of the 19th century, scholars tended to get very excited about it too, and rather saw it as evidence of Ireland being the refuge, the last refuge of classical scholars from Europe who'd been pushed out perhaps of Europe at the end of the Roman Empire by the movement of the Germanic tribes across Europe. There doesn't seem to be evidence to back that up at all. And so we sort of need to know where this Greek learning came from. And the most obvious place seems to be Canterbury, where, as you said, Theodore of Tarsus was the archbishop there. He was sent by the Pope in the late 660s. When he arrived in Canterbury, after a long journey, when he arrived, he set up a school. And because he was a native Greek speaker, he taught Greek. And Bede talks about students maybe 50 years later who had studied under Theodore, who still spoke Greek as well as they spoke their native tongue. We know there were Irish students there. Somebody talks about Theodore being hemmed in by Irish students. So the logical thing seems to be that these Irish students came back to Ireland and brought their Greek with them. It's also possible, of course, that it might have come from Europe, because there were strong trading links with the north of Spain and with Bordeaux and Nantes in France, and manuscripts as well as salt and wine and hides and things went backwards and forwards. So yeah, it might have come from there too.
Thank you for that. So there is scattered evidence for knowledge of Greek in early medieval Ireland, some of which, of course, you've just touched on there. But for example, we also have some references in the Ovra Hollam Killa, or the Canticle of Columba. And there's a reference to that great saint being skilled in, amongst other things, patristics and biblical scholarship, which you'd expect, mathematics, knowledge of the tides, and also Greek. So why do you think it was important to demonstrate knowledge of Greek during this period, during the early medieval period?
Two things come to mind immediately. And one is that Greek was a sacred language, if you like, one of the three sacred languages. It was the language that the New Testament had been originally written in. And it was the language, one of the three languages that had been written on the cross at the crucifixion. So yes, it had enormous sanctity as a language. It was a really strong tie back to the origins of Christianity. And as such, it held enormous authority. And the second thing that immediately springs to mind is the fact that not many people could do it. It was quite a rare accomplishment. And the Book of Amar really demonstrates that, because the Book of Amar seems to have been written by three separate scribes. We know the name of one of them because he wrote his name in the manuscript. He was Ferdomnach. And the other two didn't write their names in the manuscript. They've ended up being called Scribe A and Scribe B, which is a bit tough. But the Book of Amar was an extremely prestigious project. So you must assume really that the best scribes in Amar worked upon it. Amar was an important monastery. They must have been among the best scribes in the whole of Ireland. But it's really striking that the Greek is only in the sections that Ferdomnach wrote, except for one little Amen that Scribe A wrote. So yes, it's really striking that only Ferdomnach was the man who he got the best bits, if you like, the most difficult bits or the most important bits to write, like the Gospels. And so it's really striking that only that one man out of these three, obviously top class scribes, only he could write Greek. So yes, it was a very rare accomplishment. And so between the sanctity of Greek and the fact that, and its rarity, it must have, the use of it must have given an awful lot of authority to a manuscript, which would reflect on the monastery where it came from, and that would in turn sort of impress the monks in the monastery, and impress the people outside within Ireland. And we know as well that these manuscripts traveled a lot. The life of Columba actually ended up in the north of France by the beginning of the 9th century. So we know that they traveled a lot. So yes, they were probably trying to impress people in Britain and on the continent as well. So yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for your contribution, Sally. Thank you. Downus. No problem. So the last contributor which I wish to chat to is down at Eval Dune. Downut's contribution to the anthology is one of great personal interest to me, and indeed I was privileged over the summer to have visited the site which Downut had so well surveyed in Ceallaigh to the west of Galway. Downut lives in Unspidal in the Gaeltacht, and so a study of the schoolhouse of the notable 17th century antiquary Rory O'Flaherty is in essence a study of her local area. Downut's essay in the anthology surveys the ruins of a Gaelic scholar, Rory O'Flaherty's dwelling place and schoolhouse in Ceallaigh. O'Flaherty, of course, is known to Irish history as the author of a lengthy description of West Connacht in English and a remarkable Latin work which drew on numerous ancient documents in tracing Irish history back to the ages of myth and legend. Both works were published in the 1680s. What is remarkable about O'Flaherty is he had lost most of his estates under the Cromwellian persecution, and yet here he was, producing works in sophisticated Latin and in English, and in correspondence with some of the leading intellectuals of his day, such as Edward Lloyd, the keeper of the Ashmolean in Oxford, who regarded O'Flaherty as both an authority on Irish history and on language. And of course, O'Flaherty was also personally known to some of the greats in Irish history scholarship, such as the antiquarian genealogist Dúnmhacht MacIrvisig, who resided in Galway in the mid-17th century. But it seems to me O'Flaherty's significance is that he lived in a period when the native learned tradition of classical Gaelic scholarship was coming to an end. Could you perhaps outline a little bit about O'Flaherty's life and his significance?
Rory O'Flaherty was born in 1629. He lived almost 90 years, dying in 1716, 1718, that sort of time. So he had a long life. And it was a long and learned life, as you've said. His interesting background, his father, on his father's side, he was from the Gaelic aristocracy. They lived in the castle of Moycullen. They ruled an area, Gnobeg, which centres on the castle of Moycullen with its good lands. His father was chieftain there, and his grandfather. And he presumably might have assumed that he would also take up that position. His father died when he was 2, and he became a ward of court. And then we talk about the heirs of the O'Flahertys and what happened to them. But on Rory O'Flaherty's mother's side, his mother was a Darcy from Galway, and her grandfather was a Richard Martin, not Humanity Take, but an earlier man, Richard Martin, Lord Mayor of Galway. So within his own family, he had 2 sides of the, I suppose you'd say, the Catholic population of Ireland, the Gaelic side and the Anglicized or Anglo-Irish or Galway merchant side. So 2 different sides in his own family. One of the things about his life is, where was he educated? I said his father died when he was 2. He became a ward of court, and the ruling at the time, the legal ruling would have been that he should have been raised in a Protestant household and attend Trinity College. It would appear that he didn't do that. That didn't happen. So Hardiman, who's one of our main sources for the life of O'Flaherty, the main written source, written in 1840s, he's of the opinion that he was educated by Urbisha, that you've mentioned, who is a genealogist, a learned Gaelic man, and also a Dr. Walsh, Dr. Lynch, who was a priest in Galway and who may have had some connection with an earlier school and who had to leave Galway in 1652. That was when the Cromwellian takeover of Galway happened. Now, about the same time as the Cromwellian takeover of Galway, Rory O'Flaherty and his mother would have lost their lands. They must have lost about a large area of land. They lost the castle in Moycullen. They got other lands, but they were scattered and probably not of the same quality. So he was in much reduced circumstances after the 1650s. Not only that, another aspect of his life is, like many of the Gaelic people at the time, he had great faith in the Stuarts, and he thought the restoration of the Stuarts would help him. He didn't benefit from the restoration of the Stuarts, and it seems that when the William and Mary came back, he lost more lands. So in all, he lost a lot of lands, and he ended up in reduced circumstances. But where he ended up was on Park, the townland of Park, very close to where I live in Munspidden, just about 2 kilometers away. And it's an interesting place, and I wanted to have a look at that from an archaeological point of view. What was there? Where was he living? One of the quotes, something you said there now brought it to my mind. Nonagum Wirla from Galway University talked about Dulthach MacFurbisha, and he said something about him that I thought applies to O'Flaherty and maybe applies to a lot of the Gaelic families at this time. He said of MacFurbisha, he was a link between the native Gaelic learned classes and the new Anglo-Irish antiquarians, such as Usher and Ware. So that's a new group, a lot of them connected with Trinity College. They were Protestants, they were the new English, and they had antiquarian interests. So O'Flaherty was one of those that served as a sort of a link. So that's, I suppose, an aspect of his life. You were asking me about his life, and I suppose our main sources for his life, the written sources, are Hardiman, writing in the 1840s, and then Richard Sharp, who's written a great book. He edited O'Flaherty's correspondence, and his correspondence is very wide-ranging, as you've mentioned. Sharp edited his correspondence, and he gave a very learned introduction to that. So it's a great overview. And he mentions the quality of O'Flaherty's Latin. I wouldn't be in any position to talk about it, but when we're talking about Greek, I suppose we're in the same thing. He wrote verses in Latin. He wrote his book, Ogygia, which is a history of Ireland, going back into the mythology and coming forward in time. I suppose we'd call it pseudo history at this stage, but it was very learned, and it was written with a system of referencing, which would have been very unusual at the time. So it was a scholarly work in that sense, and written in Latin, but of course, writing in Latin was nearly coming to the end of its time. So as you described, his description of Ó Ceallaigh was written in English, and it was written again at the instigation of that Trinity group, the William Molyneux and his son Samuel. They were people who had an interest in science, the new sciences. They had an interest in antiquities, and often they were prepared to, for instance, William Molyneux sponsored his publication of Ogygia, and it was they who prompted him to write the description of Ó Ceallaigh, which was an unusual thing to have, because the description was by an Irish person. most of the descriptions of the countryside and of the way the land worked would not come from the Irish side, the written descriptions. They were very much of the New English, whose were inspired to a certain large extent by the military and by the need to know what the land was like for military purposes. But this was different. It was a description from an Irish point of view. So I suppose that's talking about his life. You know, that's the life he led. And then you talked about his significance as well.
Please.
Yeah. I suppose his significance was his writing of his histories and his writing in Latin and English, and then his correspondence. He corresponded in a way that was part of, we would expect, of the intellectuals of that era, the new intellectuals, and yet he belonged to an older cohort of people. But like the new intellectuals, he was prepared to use the post. He wrote letters regularly to England. He received letters regularly from England. He often complains about not having enough money to pay the postage, but he wrote and received letters to Lynch, that I mentioned earlier, who had in exile in Brittany. So he corresponded with people in other parts of Ireland. He visited and worked in Dublin. Part of the reason we know that is it was acceptable at the time to write in books, and he made notes in books that were in Trinity College and that would not have been out of the library of Trinity College. So his handwriting is there, and he signs some of his remarks. So he was there, and he was in Portumna, I think, in the Great House there. He was in Sligo at another stage. So even though allegedly he was living in poverty, he could get paper to write on, he could send letters, and he could get books to read. And he had manuscripts. Part of the reason they say he was living in poverty, I think, is the younger Molyneux visited him in Inns Park in 1700. Now, by then, by the time he visited him, 1709, O'Flaherty would have been 80 years of age. And I have a little quote from Samuel Molyneux. He says, I saw old O'Flaherty, who lives very old and in miserable condition in Park. So a lot of writers took that as this was the truth. He was living in miserable condition. But remember, O'Flaherty was 80 years of age at the time. Whereas Samuel Molyneux was 20, and he was from a wealthy Dublin family. So his view of O'Flaherty's living conditions would not have been very complimentary, I suppose. So that's partly why I started my studies. It was one of the things I read before I started studying about O'Flaherty, and I thought, was he living in such terrible poverty? And in some ways he was no longer in the castle, he was in a small house. But when you go and look at the site, as we did, Luke came and we looked at it, and inspired by what O'Donovan had written in 1840, O'Donovan wrote about the site. And he had some very nice things to say about it. He said it was a ruin of a little house, all right, but he makes the point, it's a small rude house built of small stones with lime and sand mortar. But he says, I never felt so moved as when I sat on the little hill where O'Flaherty was accustomed to study in summer. And he goes, and that would have been something he would have picked up from the locals. He says, a short distance to the south of the ruins of his house, there's a low rock covered with a mossy sward, on which the historian is said to have spent a great part of his time in the summer season studying and enjoying the beauty of the prospect. And it really is lovely. When you're on the site, you're looking out at Galway Bay and the Burren and the Aran Islands. And it's a lovely little sheltered site. There's the ruins of 5 structures. Now they're only up to 1 meter in height. I was doing a walkover archaeological survey of the area, so discovered the 5 buildings. They are, as O'Donovan said, built of rude stone. They're built of the local stone, but on the corners now, it's well shaped. They're rectangular buildings with rounded corners. And rounded corners are a feature of houses, Gaelic houses going back to medieval times. And there are records of ones that survived into the 1930s in Ireland, in the west of Ireland. So it's a traditional type house that would have presumably had a thatched roof. And so he lived in a nice little settlement. I would think he probably lived more as a landlord than a labourer. He would have still kept his status. He described something else about the area in his own description of the place. He says, the area has good pasture for cattle, but is so craggy and full of stones that it is scarce a place a plough can go. So obviously it wasn't the good land that he was used to seeing in Moycullen. But he then goes on to say, yet the tenants, by digging and manuring it so well, that they have corn for themselves, their landlord, and the market. So he's not saying that it's desperate. He was probably cash poor. He probably did find difficulty in putting money on to get his post out of Galway. But he would have been a man of status in his area, and he was regarded as a scholar and looked up to, I think. And people in the area, when lots of landowners in the area have stories about him, and it's almost supernatural powers. And Martin O'Kine writes about how he could deal with the devil and ride on the devil's back to Rome to argue with the Pope and then come back to Ireland. So he obviously had made an impression on the people of the area.
Thank you. That's a really interesting description. Of the 5 houses, which when we went there and walked over, or foundations, or the ruins, one of which possibly could be the schoolhouse or the almost scriptorium of O'Flaherty. Could you say a little bit more about perhaps the morphology of that building, as that forms a core component of your paper in the survey which you did?
This is a small rectangular building, as I say, only up to a small height, but it's looking at it, it is reminiscent of other buildings that have been identified archaeologically as schoolhouses. Now I'm talking about Ballyorley in Wexford, and talking about the O'Daverin schoolhouse, Old Cheebrack in Clare. Similar layout, a house of a similar size, a building of a similar size, looks like it may have been divided off into 2 areas, let's not say quite 2 rooms, a larger area and a smaller area, again reflecting these. Now, Ballyorley is raised right to the ground. There's only the mark on the ground. There's no height, there's no walls at all. But Cowell Cheebrack, on the other hand, there's a lot of archaeological evidence for it. Now, it would have been an earlier and probably a much higher status building, but we have nothing left at this stage without doing an excavation to say what kind of windows, for instance, might be in it, or what kind of door might have been on this building. But the setting of the building, its layout, and the stories that attach to it make it possible that this building was either a scriptorium or a schoolhouse. As the locals called it, a schoolhouse. That's what it's known as, O'Flaherty's schoolhouse. It wouldn't have been a schoolhouse in the sense of the classic bardic school. That period was over, and he wasn't, and O'Flaherty himself didn't come from a learned family, but perhaps a schoolhouse that provided for local, the children of local landowners, or perhaps, as we say, a scriptorium, a place he himself would do his writing and his studies, and maybe have some other people to help him. That's the schoolhouse, as it's called, and it's marked on the record of monuments and places as a national monument. The other building isn't that I was interested in, the other main building, is not marked as a monument, but looking at O'Donovan's description in 1840, he says he was brought to see the house, the dwelling house of O'Flaherty, and he describes it as small, rude building again, with a small chamber to the west. So I visited the site, and you can see the remains of this building, which has a small chamber to the west. It's unusual. I've looked around, I've looked at the 1840 map and the later maps, and there's no house, no other building in the area with this morphology. So I think it's definitely the building that was shown to O'Donovan as the house. And it's in this settlement, nice little area, dry, whereas a lot of Connemara is quite wet. This is a nicely chosen site, dry but close to a river. The rectangular house with the little chamber off it. No sign, there's on this one you can definitely see where the actual entrance is, because the stones there are sufficiently shaped to say, yes, that was the entrance to the house. There's what I thought initially might have been a window, but now I think maybe it's a covered area, stone covered in the north wall. The schoolhouse was east-west. This one is north. This building is oriented north-south. No sign of a fireplace, but then, you know, fire could have been in the middle of the room. It could be different. Anyway, there's a lot of the walls have fallen in. So without excavation, it would be difficult to know where the fireplace was, or if there was a fireplace. So again, very definitely rounded corners on the building, which is a very traditional style of building and style of, and also the fact that the buildings are quite narrow, which allowed roofing. Timbers at the time were not available in long lengths in general. In fact, O'Flaherty says in his own writing that the timbers for the roofs of houses were got by taking bog timber and prodding the bog to find the bog timbers, and these were what were used in roofing houses. So narrow rectangular buildings, and they're quite substantial buildings in one way. They look very small to us now, but I was looking at some other buildings that are described. O'Flaherty was of one branch. He was of one branch of the O'Flaherty family. Another branch, the main branch, is in the northern part of centred on Ballynahinch and Renville, an area people will maybe know. And in that area, the big house was at Renville. And at the same time that Lloyd, as you mentioned, he corresponded with Lloyd, but Lloyd actually came to Ireland in 1700, and he would have visited O'Flaherty. And he also visited another relation of his, Captain Edward Flaherty, who lived in Renville. And he lived in what was later called the Big House in Renville. And the Big House was just, as the description at the time was, 60 feet by 20 feet. So it was a narrow enough, a small enough area. And yet it's described as having an eating parlor, a living room, a bedroom on the ground floor. And as it said, numbers of people living in the thatch. So I suppose they were up in the loft or something in the house. So that was the Big House. So it wouldn't have been unusual that he would live perhaps in a small house. And I'm thinking of what we were saying about earlier, talking about castles and identity. Perhaps it wasn't part of the Gaelic identity at this stage to aspire to build grand mansions. You know, maybe when we think of Renville, that the Big House was quite a small house from our point of view, a small thatched house. Later members of that family went on to build grand Georgian type mansions. But at this time, the chieftain of the family lived in a very modest house. So.
Sinead, Goro Margaret.
Portugal.